morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Chris O'Connor from the Heart Failure Laboratory, and we're here with the Heart of the Matter podcast to discuss our latest think tank meeting in which we took a deep dive into the role of artificial intelligence in augmenting and enhancing clinical trial conduct. And I'm here with our distinguished panel. I'll let them introduce themselves. We'll begin with Dr. Martin Cowie.
Hi, Chris. I'm Martin Cowie. I'm a cardiologist and Senior Vice President at AstraZeneca in charge of all the late-stage trials in cardiovascular. Great pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Martin. Dr. JoAnn Lindenfeld.
Hi, everyone. I'm JoAnn Lindenfeld, a cardiologist and heart failure physician at Vanderbilt University.
Dr. Scott Solomon.
Hey, Chris and everyone. I'm Scott Solomon. I'm a cardiologist and clinical trialist at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. I guess we're now called Mass General Brigham.
Okay. We've got the merger. The Dr. Jon Cunningham.
Hi, everyone. Jon Cunningham, also from Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. I'm a heart failure cardiologist.
Dr. Mona Fiuzat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mona Fiuzat. I'm a co-chair of the Heart Failure Collaboratory and a heart failure investigator, a pharmacist by training, and my appointment is at Duke University.
And Dr. Mitch Psotka.
I'm Mitch Psotka. I'm section chief for heart failure and transplant at Nova Shar Heart and Vascular, and then the digital health working group chair for the Heart Failure Collaboratory.
Terrific. Well, let's dive right into this. The discussion was fascinating during our think tank, and it really spanned the whole broad spread of clinical trial conduct, patient identification to trial conduct to endpoints, and then to the dissemination of information. And I'll start with you, Mitch, talk about patient identification. You've been involved in some of the projects using artificial intelligence, which frankly is machine learning, to help with patient identification in a broad health system using the EHR. Could you describe how you think AI might help patient identification and clinical trial conduct?
Absolutely. So we know that a large burden of clinical trial enrollment comes in the form of patient screening, which has been traditionally performed by manual review of patient records, often those coming through a clinic or being seen in an outpatient or inpatient setting, and then performed going through the sometimes very lengthy list of inclusion and exclusion criteria that clinical trials have constructed to enroll the correct patients for their study design. And one of the ways that machine learning or algorithmic input into the electronic health record can assist with this process is by really identifying patients who meet the majority of these inclusion and exclusion criteria prior to manual review, thereby reducing the administrative burden for clinical trial enrollment, and perhaps really adding to patients who would not have been otherwise recognized because they are not being seen in a heart failure clinic or in a cardiology clinic, but out in the world in the auspices of the electronic health record, but can be identified and then brought in. And so there is both this opportunity to find patients who meet the criteria to be included more easily, but also to find patients who would not be otherwise found using the electronic health record and this kind of algorithmic identification of patients.
That would be such an advance if we can improve this sort of identification of one patient per site per month that we're often dealing with now. Martin, give us your broad thinking on, as someone who's looking over a number of clinical trials from a sponsor standpoint, how do you think AI might improve the ecosystem here?
Well, I think there's enormous hope that it will do, because it can take out a lot of the very slow, tedious work and do it super fast. And it never, and it doesn't need a coffee break. It doesn't need a weekend off. It just keeps doing it, which is a huge advantage. So I think from site selection to patient identification and, things like proteinuria, lots of cardiologists, I'm afraid, don't actually deal with urine. How can you predict from other markers in the medical record that the patient might have proteinuria and therefore should be considered for screening at least, for example, and then all the way through to endpoint adjudication, which I know Scott has an interest in also, where we've used our huge data sets to show that it's actually very good and easy to train AI to identify cardiovascular mortality from our data sets. And we can now adjudicate events within 3 minutes of finding them rather than 3 months from the conventional endpoint process. A little bit more tricky for heart failure hospitalizations, as we all know, but that will learn as well. And I think also final point is that let's make sure that we understand that AI is not necessarily just on its own, that there can be a degree of human supervision, and AI may do your first best stab at it, and then humans can add to that. So it's human plus artificial intelligence meets a faster, more efficient process. So we're very enthusiastic about it, hopefully not just hype, but actually now translating into meaningful difference.
Well, Martin, that's a really good point that, there's a lot of fear out there that AI is going to replace everything and there won't be a need for humans. And your point that this is an enhancement, that they're working together, humans and AI machine learning, I think is a really important concept. Well, one of the really strong presentations at the think tank was around the endpoints. And if we quote Norman Stockbridge correctly, he said this may be one of the top priorities to tackle first would be the work that Jon and Scott have done in this space. Scott, why did you take on the endpoint question of using machine learning and AI, and what did you find, Scott and Jon?
I think the short answer is because we were working too many weekends. No, Martin doesn't think, we do this on weekends. No, I mean, I think that, first of all, as you said, Chris, the use of AI in medicine in general has exploded, obviously, in the last several years. And we're just starting to think about how we can use them to enhance our clinical trials. And I'm very excited about this as we try to make our trials more efficient. We've been adjudicating endpoints, as you know, for many, many years in clinical trials. I think you and I started on the Valiant trial together about 25 years ago. And we realized that it is enormously time-consuming. It also can be even potentially inaccurate in some cases. We've spent a lot of time in the laboratory talking about endpoint definitions and the process of adjudicating endpoints. But we realized that if we can do this faster, if we can do this more efficiently, if we can do it with more reproducibility, we can actually make a big difference. And so Jon had been very interested in this topic and was working to utilize natural language processing to essentially determine endpoints for heart failure in an EMR system. And the main reason for doing that, we don't do that as much in the EMR in individual healthcare systems as we do in trials. In trials, we spend a tremendous amount of time and effort adjudicating. In these large data sets, we mostly use ICD codes and things like that. And we realize there's a lot of information that's available in the medical records, even in the things that we type or dictate, that can help determine if a patient has a particular disease. In this case, it's heart failure. So Jon started there and then moved on to clinical trials. And I'm going to turn to Jon and let him actually tell us a little bit about what we did.
Thanks, Scott. So as Scott mentioned, we started off looking in our own electronic health record. I labeled a bunch of cases myself, and we taught the computer to learn whether it was one that I was going to call a heart failure or not based on the 2017 SCTI criteria, the standard clinical trial criteria for heart failure hospitalizations. And then we took that model out of the box into the invested clinical trial and showed that across 157 sites in the US and Canada, the same model also worked well for picking out which hospitalizations would be called heart failure by a clinical events committee in the trial. And I think the excitement here is that we all know that high quality endpoint data is important for getting the right answer in any cardiovascular outcome analysis. And if we can improve the quality of data in our large scale data sets and improve the efficiency of getting high quality data in our adjudicated clinical trials, that's going to allow us to get better information faster for our patients.
That's terrific. And Ed, we know that these CECs are very cumbersome, very expensive. So you're tackling a big part of the core of what many of us are interested in. As I wear my health system hat, I also see an amazing opportunity here, Scott and Jon. I want you to think innovative of your ideas that, as you know, penalties for readmission, heart failure readmissions, the accurate diagnosis of those readmissions is very complex and not well done. We've done adjudication of these readmissions that have gone towards the penalty fees and found that there's a lot of errors there, misclassifications. But then there's also the whole process of the morbidity and mortality committees that go on in every hospital. And it's in my view, it's asymmetric, and there are biases in there and what cases are brought forth and how they're adjudicated. So having these standardized processes that may reduce bias could be very valuable to the health systems also.
Well,
JoAnn? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm not very good at actually assigning ICD codes to my patients when I see them in clinic. I know that I'm just doing whatever I can as quickly as I can to get through to the next patient. This is a way potentially that healthcare systems could use what we write in our notes to do that kind of assignment. And I'm sure some of them are doing this already.
And I'll just jump in, Chris. We got 60% in our analysis. So of the hospitalizations that have a primary code for heart failure, which would be the ones that the penalties would apply to, only 60% of those for us would be a SCTI criteria heart failure hospitalization. So I think there's a lot of cleaning to be done.
Very nice. Great point. JoAnn, you've served on a lot of data safety monitoring boards, and what Martin said was fascinating, and that is they can now get the deaths identified, classified within minutes, as opposed to this long lag time of monitoring the charts and getting them to the DSMC. How do you see AI helping trial conduct from a data safety monitoring committee?
Well, I think, as you've said, we'll get the data much earlier and we'll be able to make decisions. Very often endpoints are outstanding. The adjudication has not been done when you meet. I think more than that, I think everything that's been said is exciting. I was excited by this paper and doing adjudicating the endpoints for several reasons. One, we all know on those committees that we keep a log. Okay, how are we going to decide this when we do it again? How are we going to decide this when we do it again? And it'll be much, much better to have consistency. And after the first few trials do it this way, then we'll learn if that's exactly the right way or not. So that will be enormously helpful. I mean, I see, as Jon said, applying this back to our patients and saying, okay, that last admission wasn't really a heart failure admission. You guys goofed. Think about it this way. But more than that, there's just, when we think about screening for patients, there's a huge amount more that could go into this. So the whole thing is somebody has to screen, somebody has to look at, now you get the criteria. It can automatically correct for weight if you decide to do that. It can notify you who the primary physician is. Potentially, if you check on yes screened for the study, you could send a note to the primary physician, say, are you on board with having your patient be this study with a 1-paragraph or 2-sentence synopsis of the study? And would you be agreeable to having your patient be called? And do all of those things that take several phone calls, and even to the point of saying, your doctor has agreed to let us send you this through your My Health at Vanderbilt or whatever. This research study, here's something about it. Click on this if you'd like more information. We'd like to speak to you about the study. All of those things could be done in a very rapid period of time, and that could really be exciting. I mean, we could see how this could save weeks and months of time. So, very exciting. Not to mention, it could search the chart, right? When you say, why aren't they on guideline-directed medical therapy? It can search the chart for why aren't they on spironolactone. There's probably reasons, but sometimes they're buried way back in there, and it takes the coordinators hours to find those things. But there's often reasons, sometimes there's not, but there often are, and then you can get that and document it from the source code. So And that will even go through the Care Everywhere, the remote things that we get that just are enormously time consuming. So that's really exciting.
The same technology that is used for the endpoint adjudication could be used at the front end for inclusion criteria, could be used for adverse event reporting. That it's really all different sides of the coin and could make every part of the process more efficient.
And do you see a point, Jon and Scott, where you could say your patient has a 93% chance of not tolerating Entresto? No, seriously. So we don't think you have to go there necessarily.
Yeah, you just need a labeled data set of people who had the same input, who had an outcome, who either, did or did not tolerate it.
Well, and even to the point where I think this would help primary caregivers and general cardiologists who don't do it every single day to say, all right, you can start spironolactone, but you need to check potassium in 4 days, or you need to check potassium in 2 weeks, or just give you those from the criteria we see, this is what you need to do. And that will be enormously helpful to people.
That's terrific. You're exactly right. I mean, I think that's kind of the 2.0 of AI in our medicine practice, right? Is guiding the dosing.
Chris, I think we have to be slightly careful because the concept of a digital twin where you can do trials in silico. So let's just say we simulate humans and we do a trial in 10 seconds and say, well, actually, this drug would have this effect, so let's not bother. I think that looks great on paper and on PowerPoint, but actually there's nothing like empiric evidence to show that you don't actually understand this as much as you thought and that the patterns may be spurious. So I think, and maybe as a trialist, I would argue this, that actually doing a trial is an important part of this process, but AI can speed up that and get rid of a lot of the slow, clunky processes. And within my company, for example, we hope to submit instead of an average of 20 weeks after the database is locked, down to 3 weeks ultimately. So that gets science into medicine so much more quickly. And actually, the data is being used almost immediately to make a difference. So for me, I think that's more realistic. And I feel it's a bit sci-fi, all of this. Let's just simulate humans and see how they get on. Maybe I'm a bit on the end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I don't think we want to skip the trials, but I do think as we gain actual trial data with real people in the studies, that some of these things will be predictable. You're not likely to tolerate this. And that will be, I think, valuable for people who do it less. For instance, my experience is that, for instance, general internists who do heart failure, if you start spironolactone and you get really hyperkalemic one time, that people tend to not do it again. So, but there's just very rough guidelines in the guidelines for how to do it and what to expect. And I think through these trials, we're going to be able to get much more precise data for practitioners to be able to do those things and do them safely.
Yeah, experience clinician is pattern recognition, isn't it? And AI is all about pattern recognition. Right. So can you make a new medical student actually behave like a 20-year experienced cardiologist? Probably with an AI tool, maybe.
I think Martin and JoAnn make such important points that, first of all, we have to separate the hype of AI from the reality. And the fact is, it's just going to get better over the next several years. But we have to be very cognizant of what it can do at the moment, what we trust it with. We've all played around with ChatGPT. We know that it hallucinates. On the other hand, it's gotten better in the last year. I try to stump it all the time. I edit a textbook of cardiology, and we are incorporating AI, a ChatGPT-like interface to be able to query the textbook and get information from the book that hopefully is usable by clinicians. So there's that aspect within the clinical trials realm. I mean, I'm really glad to hear a drug developer saying that they're not going to abandon clinical trials and just do things in silico, because we've all heard companies saying they can do this, and we have to be very clear. And I'm sure Mitch, with your FDA hat on, you feel this way. That's very unlikely. It's probably reasonable at the very early stages when you're trying to pick molecules, but we don't have enough information to understand for the computers to actually get the biology right and pick out all the things that happen to people when you give them drugs.
And I just want to follow on what you just said, Scott. When I tried to write my chapter for your book using ChatGPT, it hallucinated all of the references that I wanted to use. Not one of them was a real reference. And so just to be clear, it really is at the nascent stage of using this technology, particularly the productive aspect of this technology. When it's being asked to produce something, right? It sounds very realistic, but it typically, that is where the technology is not really up to par. And but I think the other way to think about it is we've been using predictive models in a lot of ways. I think Dr. O'Connor has created a number of predictive models in the history of his manuscript writing, and they are used to assign likelihoods of events happening or of things happening. And I think that those sort of predictive models we are starting to really incorporate more and more into clinical practice. And as more data is collected, as we've been discussed, those predictive models can be more elaborate and perhaps more accurate in helping clinicians to make decisions. But really, again, like Martin was saying, not replacing the clinician in the activity, but really just assisting them to make the right call at the right time.
And if I could jump in, one of the discussions that we had was around, the role of the editors as a regulatory body, because so much implementation is dependent on what's in the literature and how to, ensure that the literature is valid. Right now they're at a stage of, declaring if you use ChatGPT, but I don't think that's nearly enough. And it's very dependent on the author's honesty. Somebody who's not willing to be honest, I think, could very easily be putting garbage into the literature. And I think that's one of the downsides. I don't know how an editor, having been on that side of publishing, would ever know how to distinguish a real paper from a false one.
Well, Mona, thanks for jumping in on the editorial side. The other aspect of this very cumbersome process of getting information out is peer review. And could we imagine a world where peer review was doing what Jon showed us and Scott? And that is, right now we don't have enough adequately trained peer reviewers, and we're burning the ones we have out. But could we say, okay, every paper now being reviewed could be reviewed by the AI reviewer and one human reviewer in a hybrid model? What do you think?
Well, just I'll take that. I'm not sure we're quite there yet. But to bring up this idea of a hybrid model, and that's something that Jon mentioned the other day in his discussion, in that, you rather than just say, is this going to be all AI, it's more like what I would call driver assist. I have one of these cars that you can press a button and it'll pretty much steer for you, but you've got to keep your hands on the wheel and you've got to be ready to take over. And that's the kind of thing that we're thinking about in adjudication processes, where you might use AI to help decide, for example, the cases that are definitely heart failure hospitalization, for example, or definitely not a heart failure hospitalization, but the ones that for which the AI can't make that determination so easily. There in the intermediate zone, you would have human beings involved, but it could still dramatically improve the work. I was going to ask one other question, Chris, if I may, and Martin, you may have some thoughts about this, about the use potentially of AI in monitoring of clinical trials. Mm-hmm. That's a place where you guys are spending so much money, and I imagine this is a way that you could potentially identify fraud, for example, or identify certainly sloppy investigation. I can think of a lot of ways in which AI might be helpful in that respect.
I agree, Scott. And I think, we try and do proportionate monitoring because you can't be 100% intense on everything. And I think AI will help us with that, looking for patterns of bad behavior and poor quality, etc., and picking that up earlier rather than later. But also coming back to your point about AI being, let's say very likely or very unlikely to be something, that's fine. You can trust it in the middle. That's where humans need to add their value to it. The FDA seems very open to that, and our discussions with them have been very positive, very supportive, very willing to explore it and say, let's go on this journey together, see where it takes us. I think other regulators are way behind that and still very fixed on humans being the ultimate judge of everything, and that's the gold standard. But I think all of us have been on endpoints committees, and we know sometimes how much discussion there is about individual cases, and I'm not even sure there's a ground truth for some cases. It's very difficult in multi-morbid elderly patients to know exactly what is going on. So it is a balance of probabilities. But that kind of mature, nuanced attitude, I think, is quite difficult to communicate with regulators who like certainty. So it's an interesting time, but I think there's lots of people on this journey, not just the trialists and clinicians.
Yeah, Chris, one thing that I'd like to be disabused of this concern about AI that sometimes I don't hear is that as AI takes over the simple things, we all do those things now. We adjust the potassium, we look at the blood, we do all those things. So if we get a program that doesn't quite right, humans feel comfortable saying, wait a minute, this doesn't seem quite right to me. That as all of us start to have the simple things taken over and we never do them, how do we become, if you don't know how to do all the little parts of it, how do you become the final adjudicator of what you get? How do you do the driving when you don't understand, you haven't been doing any of the turns or, putting on your turn signal? That just is the one thing I don't see a solution for. When you stop having all that baseline experience, it's made you able to say, I don't think this I'm going to step away from this program. I'm not sure we'll be able to do it once there aren't a group of people that have the experience to say this isn't right.
Well, we've had that experience, and that's called a plane crash.
Yeah.
We know that pilots who haven't had the training on the manual adjustments of the instrument board, they're relying on the completely on the electronics, have stuttered or failed in their ability to compensate. So you bring up a really good point. I was going to go around the table and just in our conclusion, and I'll count that as your concern. But give us your top concern about AI in medicine. And JoAnn, you so nicely articulated one, but I'll go around the table here. Mona? Top
misinformation.
concern.
One word, misinformation.
Okay. One word, Mitch.
Well, I'm going to follow in Mona's footsteps because I do think, and going with Dr. Califf, that misinformation is one of the greatest challenges to the data that we create and utilizing it appropriately and knowing what is real and what is fake for not only the clinical trials, but all of the population.
Jon?
I think portability. I think we always have to worry that we trained in one area and then we're evaluating in a different time, in a different place. And that, if it was a human doing the review, then they would say, wow, these documents really look different or something's wrong. But, the computer just sort of plows forward and gives an answer anyway. So we want to keep checking that, keep our eyes on the data and keep making sure that, the computer's saying the right thing.
Martin?
I think let's just make sure we're not just copying human biases. You can use AI to train an interview panel to come up with exactly the same biases as the humans very predictably. That's not what it's about. It's supposed to be adding value, not just simulating it. So yeah, let's just think about the use cases and what we're trying to achieve. And as I said earlier, AI plus human intelligence is what we're looking for.
I love it. I love it. Scott?
And I worry about overhype. And I think we have to figure out what AI can do for us at the moment. We have to recognize that it's going to change dramatically, very fast, very different from drugs, which take maybe 10 years to really change. But the AI will change in months. And we're going to update the algorithms very quickly. So we have to be cognizant of that and adapt how we work based on how the AI changes. Ultimately, I think it will be a good thing if we keep our hands on the wheel.
Really well said. And I'll agree with Martin that the biases could actually enhance disparities in care, not reduce them. So that's really my fear, that the data sets that we have may not be robust enough to help us reduce disparities. So a terrific conversation today. Gosh, you're so shy and no energy at 4:00 in the afternoon, but wow, AI is going to be with us. It's going to be with us in medicine. It's going to be with us in clinical trial development. And I really appreciate your comments today. And we're going to have more of this. I guarantee you that Heart Failure Collaboratory will be taking this on strongly. So thank you for being here with Heart of the Matter podcast. Have a great day.